Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is M, and this will be the last YouTube video that we record under the name Loco Pojo. We're retiring the username. While I will probably always maintain the Pojo as one of my personal avatars of creativity and chaos and unlimited potential in very finite forms, this name no longer really fits me. So we're going to be retiring it and adopting a new username, which I will be fully announcing tomorrow on Wednesday before we go on a big stream for Eternal Unleashed under the new username. I'm going to have an absolute blast. We're going to be playing a bunch of draft. We're going to be doing a lot of shenanigans with new deck brews. I've already got some pretty wicked, crazy ideas. And yeah, you'll all get to see the new username. We've even managed to slip a small Eternal reference in there. So I'm very, very excited about it. So stay tuned because tomorrow the announcement happens, and then with any luck, all of my different profiles and channels should switch over, or should be switched over by that time. Okay. So, with that in mind, let's get into some card breakdowns, shall we? All right. We have a lot of spoilers to get through. There's been many, many spoilers since our last spoiler review, and we're going to be starting with Boundless Knowledge, because these are in no particular order at all. Boundless Knowledge is a 4-cost Unleash, draw 2 cards at double blue influence. It's a fast spell, so it can be very favorably compared to Wisdom of the Elders, a 3-cost card with the same influence cost, same speed, but without the text Unleash. Boundless Knowledge is obviously a little bit slower. If you want to be drawing a lot of cards, it is definitely very, very good, but it is definitely something that belongs in a control format, because if you are drawing these cards at fast speed, that does mean that you can do it at the end of your turn when you haven't spent your mana on a death strike or an ambush creature or any number of other interesting tricks, but it still makes it a little bit more unwieldy when you're trying to hit a particular piece of mana, or rather hit a particular piece of power or sigil and fix your stuff. Nonetheless, this card does get you 4 cards at 8 and 6 cards at 12, and if you reduce the cost of it even by 1, it becomes a wisdom that you can repeat over and over and over again, and the amount of value that that provides you is pretty disgusting. I think this card will be a pretty reasonable A-tier card in Throne, and most likely quite strong in Expedition and Draft as well. Just the amount of different things that you can do with it, either reducing the cost of it with cards like Trail Stories and our new fun little Yeti, or just playing with it as it is and using it as a normal draw 2 that you can then get way more cards out of when you're playing big control, is just going to be a really, really delightful time. This is a solid uncommon. It plays pretty well in every format that it's in. In a smaller, lower-powered Expedition format, you're not going to miss that extra power really that much, and having the extra cards will be such a huge change. So definitely, definitely worth the hit. Next up, we have Sakalis, the Force Mage. 6-cost, triple in Cambrai, and 5/5 charge. When Sakalis hits the enemy player, he gets that much strength and health, so strength and health assumably equal to the damage that he is dealing, which in this case is 5 usually, then 10, then 20, and so on and so forth as this card just doubles in size. Cambrai's definitely got a doubling theme in general, but this is a pretty strong implementation of it, especially since the summon also gives one of your units taunt, allowing you to tie up one of their blockers with a unit that isn't Sakalis, while Sakalis gets through for an early 5 damage that then spirals into a big 10/10 monster, forcing your opponent to block multiple times just on account of its raw size. Once this card hits the enemy player once, it might as well effectively have taunt, because you're really not ever going to want to take 10 from Sakalis or allow him to double up to a 20/20. In addition, the card having charge means that if you have any sort of recursion stuff, not terribly likely when you're in Combray this deep, but if you do have some kind of recursion, then after you get this card up to a 10/10, you can then Dark Return it or pull it back from the void, play it as a 10/10, and it'll still have charge, so you can get an amazing amount of surprise damage in with this. This is a really, really solid mid-range piece. I think it's a really good Expedition card. Probably doesn't belong in Throne just due to the fact that the card does not have a lot of survivability. 5/5 is definitely something that's reasonably powerful, but this can be removed by basically every removal under the sun, except Victimless Crime, of course, or Annihilate. But nonetheless, it is pretty likely to be destroyed by a wide variety of different effects because it doesn't have any sort of protection in and of itself. And as a result, in a fairly high-powered format, I believe that most Throne decks are not really going to love it. Still, it's an amazing Expedition option. It should actually rule the landscape in certain Expedition and draft decks. I would say at the very least it's like a B+ card in those decks, and you're going to feel pretty happy to pick this up in a limited format because, oh boy, is it going to do some ridiculous nonsense then. Next up, we have Diamond of the Valley. At the start of each player's turn, they draw an additional card. Players may play an additional power on their turns, and Entomb gains 7 health. So this is a card that basically gives you no particular benefit. It forces your ally to draw, or forces your enemy to draw an additional card before you do, and then the only advantage is that players can play additional power, which means that if you are playing a more power heavy deck, you're likely to be able to play more power out than your opponent. Overall, I don't think this is going to be an amazing option. It doesn't seem particularly strong in a limited format because it's a very slow relic that doesn't do a lot and really doesn't have a lot of advantages to it. In Expedition or Throne, obviously the card really supports mid-range options and makes everything more powerful, but it's also doing a lot of the same things that like Fire Sale or the green partnership card that plays Justice Sigil would do, which is give your opponent a benefit before you get one, and the benefit is just that you can play more expensive cards more frequently. I'm not certain this card belongs in any deck. The overall strength of it is just like a little bit low. Obviously, we're going to try to play around with it, and the fact that you can sacrifice it for a small amount of health, or that if it gets destroyed you get a bunch of health, does mean that there are some like potential options to just sort of play this out, and your opponent will most likely just live with it because they aren't going to want to give you 7 health off of their ruin or something along those lines. If you're trying to sacrifice it yourself, then that's a really bad life gain spell, but the Entomb does mean that the card itself is more reasonable as an option to sacrifice, and also more reasonable as a card to just sort of have down as a global effect. Still, 4 is a really, really high cost for a card of this particular aspect. It does really, really support those mid-range strategies, but I would say this card is not very strong in power level despite being extremely fun to play with. Forged Deed. Steal an enemy relic at the end of your next turn, sacrifice it. This is great. The current, I believe, way that Shadow can deal with relics is like burglarize, which is steal a relic, put it into your hand, and that is not a great way to get rid of a relic. Forged Deed, on the other hand, actually gets rid of the relic. It allows you to play around with it, and then it also allows you to sacrifice it for certain benefits. If you're up against, say, I don't know, that Dinosaur Valley that we just saw, we actually just get to gain the 7 health, steal the effect, and do some pretty wild stuff with it. I think that overall this is going to be really, really reasonable for Xenon decks that want to deal with relics, because having attachment destruction is a little bit harder for any deck that's deep into Shadow. Obviously, Time does have its own relic destruction, so there are certain options where it's going to be less good, but I think that this still makes the market in certain Throne decks and should be really, really fun in Expedition as your relic removal of choice for a Shadow-based deck. Whether or not you're willing to splash Time for that relic removal is a little bit tricky, but overall the amount of value that the card gives you is pretty reasonable, and the fact that you get to enjoy it for an entire turn before something cool happens afterwards means that you do get some pretty decent stuff out of it. Next up, Poacher's Menagerie. This is a 4-cost relic that says at the start of your turn, play a random 1-cost unit. then increase this ability by 1. With the Entomb, sacrifice all of those units. This is a super cool card if you are trying to play around with Entomb effects in particular. If you are using this to just get cards that have good Entomb effects or good sacrifice effects, or even just good summon effects, then you can really get a lot of benefit out of it, even though the units die when the relic is destroyed. Because basically every single time that you get to play one of these units, it triggers some sort of beneficial effect on the board for you. And then once the menagerie is finally destroyed, if they have good entombs, then they get eaten, and you get even more benefits out of it, which is pretty cool. Argenport doesn't have an amazing set of, like, I think a lot of times when I'm thinking of, like, interesting entombs, I'm definitely thinking of Stonescar stuff. There are some pretty cool Argenport ones, but a lot of them tend to be, like, just the sigil related or other things like that. Still, there's a lot of interesting potential for a cool build around this particular card. That being said, this is a card that is a build around, which is to say that you are definitely building a Poacher's Menagerie deck if you have Poacher's Menagerie in your deck, which means it isn't going to be a staple by any means in any particular format. Still, it's something that you'd play, I think, if you were in an expedition, or if you were in a limited format. If you're in draft and you grab a Poacher's Menagerie, you're going to get some decent cards out of this, and the fact that they're all linked to the Poacher's Menagerie still means that you're getting a minor amount of value out of summoning those units out of your deck and basically just getting some cool stuff going. But it does leave you fairly vulnerable to weird sweepers. Fast relic removal could definitely just destroy your entire board and open you up for a big attack. There's a lot of potential for this to go wrong if you're not using it in a deck that is built specifically around the card. Still, really interesting options. The one thing about it is that the start of your turn effect does mean that this card doesn't do anything on the turn it is played, and 4-cost relics that don't do anything on the turn they are played are pretty frequently very bad. We will see. This one does provide you with a lot of different value, but there's a lot of weakness to it as well, so I'm skeptical of it in Expedition and in Throne. Golden Horn Security. This one's gonna be too small because the image was 3-cost 4/3 with Unleash, notably, so that means that it's pretty easy to play in multiple copies of this. When it attacks with another Minotaur, all of your Minotaurs get +1 strength this turn. So this is one of the most efficient Unleash cards that we've seen. 4/3 for 3 is really efficient. 3/3 for 3 is generally your standard if you are looking at like any sort of limited format or expedition format. Usually you do not see units with 4 strength, 4/3 this early. Double influence does mean that it's a little bit harder to play it, but I mean, 3-cost is also a really cheap cost for an Unleash card. Imagine if you're playing, for example, with a Miner's Musket, and the first thing that you draw is a Golden Horn Security. Suddenly you've got 3 4/3 Minotaurs on turn 3, and you just get to go completely nuts because those Minotaurs also attack and give themselves additional Minotaur bonuses. This could be a pretty wild aggro card in certain Stonescar Throne decks, even though 3 health is a little bit light for some of the things that you might be wanting to do with it. Still, it's really sick. There's a lot of good options available to play around with it, and yeah, I think it should be very good in Expedition just due to the fact that it's a lot of raw value in an Unleashed card that you can really play around with pretty easily. Definitely happy to see this in a limited format. Really happy to see it in Throne. If you are building just a very specific Minotaurs deck, Minotaurs is probably not ever going to like rock the meta, but I think that has some potential for an interesting Throne list. Alright, Soulfire. Deal 3 damage, has Unleash, and it's a fast spell too, which means it's actually like a torch speed Unleash card. So let's see here. We have seen a 3-cost for 3 with a skill on it before, and that card is just an extremely good draft card that people are really happy to play. It's the one that scouts. This one basically plays multiple copies of itself. So amongst other things, this is just a pretty efficient Flame Blast, right? Like 3 for 3, 6 for 6, 9 for 9. This is a really good way to just kill an opponent. It deals 3 damage, so it can deal damage to sites, it can deal damage to units, it can deal damage to players. And if you reduce the cost down on this card by any amount, suddenly it becomes a really sickly efficient burn spell. I actually think Soulfire might be kind of busted depending on the circumstances. Like, red already has at least one unit that just reduces the cost of the top card of your deck by one. So if you can even do that once, like, that just gets you to really, really efficient burn in a very, very efficient format at fast speed. Not only that, but you can spread it out between different units, thus giving you like sort of a basically like a harsh roll type effect where you're just like Soulfire, 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 or you can point all of that damage directly at face and just do a ridiculous amount of nonsense. You have to be a little deep in red to do it, but that's not very much of a problem when you're looking at like 9 or 10 mana. So I think this card sees play in Expedition. I think it sees play in Throne, and I think it sees play in Limited, and in all of it, it's going to be just a workhorse card. This card does most of the damage that you want to do. It is an excellent combo mechanic tool on top of that, and it's just a good removal card. So yeah, seems really, really solid. Even though 3 damage is maybe a little inefficient for 3 if you're using it solely as a removal card, that Unleash goes a long way to make this card worth it. I think this is pretty sick. Next up, we have Hexavore, 4/4 Overwhelm, can't be stolen. Now, if the enemy player makes you discard it, play it from your void. So this card is very meta-specific, I would say, but 3 cost 4/4 Overwhelm alone makes it really, really worth it as a limited card. Like, you just want to play this in draft because it's big and it's nasty and it's got a little bit of reach, and it also doesn't die to a lot of like random shadow removal in the form of stealing. There's a 6 cost card that steals a card and gives it taunt. Hexavore doesn't respond to that, and if you make this card bigger and make it a continuous problem for shadow, that's one less way that they have to deal with it. So a lot of cool things on that front, but mostly just very efficient for stats. The thing that gets really wild is when the enemy player makes you discard Hexavore from your hand, something that they're very likely to do if they are playing Zito Cabal Housecat. If you are playing a 1-drop, the common thing is to just play Zito, force a discard on turn 1, and then just skip your turn 2, and Hexavore makes that a terrible, terrible idea. Because not only do you discard and play a Hexavore on turn 1, but your opponent is in debt and can't respond to it until turn 3, which means you get to do some nonsense to them. So if you hate Zito Cabal Housecat, this is the card for you in Expedition. Boy, howdy. It's also really good in Throne for the exact same reasons, responding to Abduct, responding to Zito, responding to any early unit discard that forces a card out of your hand with unrelenting, extreme value and damage. And that particular void that it's filling, that particular anti-discard synergy that it's putting into, makes it a reasonable meta pick for just about any format if discard is particularly heavy. And once that happens, like, you just get into some nonsense. It's definitely worth it under those circumstances. I think this card's really, really powerful. It's one of the more interesting cards that's been printed, and it's really, really interesting as a counter pick. Counter picks are not always powerful on their own, but this one just has the stats to be fine, even without that. Minotaur Brawl is next. Of course, everything's a little bit weird on size, but we can just fit that screen. Okay. 5 cost, double time, double green. Your units get +2/+2 and taunt this turn. Really decent amount of things going on here. First off, you're forcing blocks, which means that if you have a large board, you can just wipe out your opponent's board, no problem. It's not quite the same as, say, giving them Overwhelm this turn, which would make this card a complete blowout, but this is a really good way to get a lot of value out of your cards. In Throne or Expedition, I'm not 100% certain how much I like this card, because the thing that is very interesting about it is that it forces all of these blocks, but if you force a bunch of bad blocks, there are a couple of things that can happen. One, removal cards can still tank your day, so you could just, like, be in a situation where you've got two attackers, you give both of them +2/+2 and taunt, and then your opponent annihilates death strikes or annihilates victimless crimes, and then suddenly you don't have units anymore. Minotaur Brawl does not give your units any survivability against hard removal like that. It also doesn't give them any survivability against sweepers, and in both circumstances you're tapping out an awful lot of power to get a bonus effect on board that is really, really good, don't get me wrong, but the aftermath is something that your opponent can play out of. So this isn't necessarily the be-all, end-all play that a lot of other cards that give you those big boosts are. Still, it's pretty efficient for the amount of power that you're getting. Obviously, a bomb limited card, really, really strong in Expedition. Throne-wise, I'd give it like a C, C+. I think there are other ways to boost up your units that might be a little bit better. Even if that one's reasonably efficient for the +2/+2 bonus, I think that usually costs around 6. Loaded Toss is a 2-cost. Scout, draw a card, and if that card costs 7 or more, you create and draw another Loaded Toss. I don't think this card is great. It's losing a lot of card advantage to basically potentially gain card advantage if you have a deck that is built wrong. We do like to build decks wrong, particularly big fire decks, because Lava Blood Goliath, the new Yeti, Birthright, all of that ridiculous nonsense definitely exists in a space where building a deck filled with 7-drops is really, really fun, and Loaded Toss kind of contributes to that by basically just giving you the ability to draw a lot of those cards into your hand very quickly. On the other hand, most of the cards that already interact with these cards, like the Great Kiln Titan, or the Lonely Yeti, or the Birthright, generally interact with them when they're on top of your deck and not when they're in your hand. So this is maybe more focused around something that wants to like generate lots of temporary power to produce 7 costs, and I'm not really sure that that format exists. In any case, the main weakness about this card is that the card advantage is pretty bad. If you are actually getting a successful Loaded Toss off, then you are just not gaining any card advantage off the first one. The second one gives you some card advantage, and if you continue to succeed on your Loaded Tosses, then you get a lot of card advantage. But the main thing about that is that you also still have to be drawing power and the cards that allow you to get to those 7-drops, and you have to be playing them when you're spending 2 power every turn, or 2 power on consistent turns to just draw a bunch of Loaded Tosses. If you have infinite mana, which infinite power is definitely always fun, then this card is great because you can just use it to pull all of the big 7-drops out of your deck as fast as you can, and hopefully get a continued streak of good cards that really gets you where you want to be going. But getting that much power is quite a struggle and will probably require a lot of cards that don't cost 7 or more, so successfully hitting a Loaded Toss is, I think, unlikely. Still, this is a really interesting build around me card that seems kind of designed for exactly our style of deck building, so overall, it might end up being something that we play around with quite a bit. There's definitely some distinct possibilities for this to be actually in a deck of ours. Grim Reminders next. It's an Inscribe. At the start of your turn, deal a damage to the cursed player and gain a health. I don't know. This is pretty bad. It's got the Inscribe, which is very nice, but the general thing that you get out of this is inevitability in the form of health gain and damage dealt to the cursed player. This effect already exists on other cards that are a little bit cheaper. I think Mindbreaker's Staff is an example of this, where you actually get something really cool out of it at the end of the game. It's like it's also a 4-cost, has the same effect, but once it triggers 3 times, you get to play a card out of your opponent's deck. This is something where you just kind of get to peck at them a bunch, and I don't think that's super worth it. It's just not a very good card. Really shouldn't be at rare, and except for that does mean that you won't see it that much in limited, and you probably wouldn't want to. So yeah, not a lot of love for this one, I'm afraid. It's kind of an iffy design. The Inscribe is definitely worth it if you're in, like, maybe draft, but most of the time you're not really going to be playing this, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense either way. Lake Terror. At the start of each turn, exhaust Lake Terror. Frenzy, ready Lake Terror. It's a 7/6 for 3. So This is really pretty interesting. There's a lot of good options available, obviously, with this card, where basically you're just trying to play like snowballs to ready the card and then attack with it. Playing fast spells to ready it as a blocker is a lot more exciting, but that's also a little bit rarer in Elysian, where you mostly have access to like cards that fast react to units attacking, like Lightning Strike, and cards that do small amounts of damage, like Snowball. Those are the more common designs of blue cards, so having a lot of cards that actually deal direct damage to your opponent's face to ready this card as a blocker seems unlikely. This is more likely to be attacking as a 7/6. That gives some potential. Obviously, if this card like has taunt, it is disgusting. If this card is attacking on its own every turn somehow, it is disgusting. But you do have to repeatedly trigger that frenzy, and it is the start of each turn that the card exhausts, which includes your opponent's turns. So yeah, also, the influence cost, double time, double primal, does mean that it's a lot less likely to actually be played on turn 3 when that crazy efficient stat line becomes the most powerful. If you're playing it on turn 4, it's a 6/7 on turn 5 when it's attacking, which is still probably going to be bigger than your opponent, but by turn 6, they'll most likely have an answer to it. Still, this is a card that demands some interesting build around me decks that play around with Frenzy. It is clearly super efficient, and the payoff is great if you can actually get it to trigger. I would see this card maybe being played a little bit in Throne decks just because it's very, very interesting. On the other hand, wherever removal is very prevalent and can actually kill the Lake Terror consistently, that is something that you have to worry about, because if something can just easily disrupt this particular effect while also causing you to waste your snowballs, that can cause a lot of problems for you in terms of your overall deck strategy. Still, really interesting card, definitely does some cool stuff on that front, and very, very fun design. I really, really like the card's design overall. Dyerwood Hymn is a 2-cost. Draw one of the top 3 cards of your deck, bottom the rest. If you have no cards in hand, you draw any card from your deck instead. So, pretty interesting stuff here. First off, this is a 2-cost tutor, which is absolutely kind of sick. If you are looking for a very particular card, you can always just try to empty out your hand and get just that card. The thing about that is that if you're looking for the card as part of like a combo, that's not going to happen because you have to empty your hand before Dyerwood Hymn works. In addition, like it's just like a little bit tricky to get all of that kind of stuff going. Still, 2 costs to draw a card off of the top 3 cards of your deck is pretty decent selection. You have a good chance of hitting like power with this if you actually need power. You have a good chance of hitting a piece of your combo if you're looking for a combo card. To that end, I think this card probably sees a little bit of play in Throne. Like, it's just really interesting where when you're in that sort of desperate situation, you can just draw your Channel the Tempest and then play it. In those circumstances, like, I think Feln decks are going to have a blast with it. And even when they're just looking at the top 3, that's really not too bad. That's like strategize level shenanigans where you just get to do some pretty interesting card selection and get a decent look at your deck and get to the cards that you want to play as quickly as humanly possible. This card makes your deck smaller, and that's something that generally is really desirable in any kind of card game. Good tutoring is always interesting. This is definitely along the lines of pretty interesting tutoring. Could be a completely broken card just due to its card selection. Can't remember. Choose a unit in the enemy player's deck. Discard each copy from their hand and deck, and give them Voidbound. The enemy player draws a card for each copy discarded from their hand. This is a pretty interesting implementation of the sort of Avograft style mechanic where you are basically denying your opponent certain types of cards. Generally, the format where you make the card not be in their deck anymore is not quite as strong as the format where you make the card dead in their hand, aka Avograft, where it's just like, you can't play this card anymore until you get rid of my very expensive relic. But this is a card that basically says that if there is a particular card that is a key strategy for your opponent's deck, you can just take it out of their deck, it's not good it's gone. It gets void bound, so there's absolutely no way to take void bound off of a card. And when that happens, they get to draw some cards for the copies that they discard from their hand, but that does mean that they don't have that card in their hand anymore. So if you're particularly worried about, say, Governor Sahin or Zytram, the Twisted Mind, who already has Voidbound, but is a like really interesting card to be playing on the top end. There's a lot of like interesting options where basically, oh, your opponent just doesn't have Akarias anymore? Cool. That seems like might cause a problem for that Valkyrie deck. I think in any situation where your opponent is looking for a very, very specific top end, Heart of the Vault, any sort of like interesting shenanigans like that, this is a card that does do a little bit of work on that front. But at the same time, anything that sort of lobotomizes in this fashion usually isn't that strong, particularly considering the card does not imply or create any kind of card advantage. In fact, it specifically loses card advantage for you because those cards go away. But if the plan is to make it so that a card can't be played anymore and just turn off your opponent's deck, that can be a really useful strategy, and I can see this card being very relevant in Throne or Expedition if the market happens to exist in the format. All right, the Skycrag 6. Draw 6 random heroes with different names from your deck. If you didn't have 10 or more total heroes with different names in your deck when you played the card, discard 3 cards at random. So this is a really weird one. 9 cost draw 6 honestly doesn't seem that good to me. It is kind of up there in like Channel the Tempest land where you're getting a ton of extra card advantage late in the game. But even in like a Highlander deck where you're playing a bunch of different heroes, there's a small chance that you're not gonna have 10 of them in your deck because 22 different cards units say in your deck as like a standard. Like, if you have like 24 differently named heroes in this deck, the chance that you draw 14 of them before you play the Skycrag 6, I think, isn't out of the question. And also, after you play the first one, you're very likely to not succeed on the second one. So it's just gonna get really, really difficult to not just get 3 cards worth of advantage for this. And 9 cost get 3 cards is, I mean, it's still okay, but this is a slow card that doesn't have any immediate payoff, and the only benefit to it is that you get heroes, which, while heroes do compose deck strategies, you typically don't want just one of any of them. So, I don't know, it's got some potential for some weird hero-based Highlander shenanigans, maybe something where you're playing around with that 5 cost that also cares about differently named cards, but mostly this card doesn't see a lot of play in my opinion. I think it's just a little bit on the weak side for that. Still, it's a sweet bit of art. It's interesting to see Caleb gallivanting about on top of the mountain. I think he's supposed to be doing some diplomacy down in Argenport, but nope, just went off and joined a roving band of heroes. That's the way to go. Next up, we have the Minotaur Taylor. This is a 2/3 summon. Give one of your other units +1 health and taunt this turn. Really pretty efficient and very good draft card. 2/3 is pretty decent. The taunt ability combined with a little bonus health is a decent little trick. I think overall this is pretty likely to remove one of your opponent's units while giving you a 2/3. That's not bad. You do have to be playing a little bit aggressive. It is bad if you are in a situation where you aren't playing a lot of 1 or 2 drops, so that's something to keep an eye out for, but taunt is pretty effective in certain circumstances, and if you're playing reasonably efficient green cards, then you can get a lot of benefit out of this pretty quickly. I think the thing that I can sort of see in this is something like, a Hojin on turn 2, combined with a Minotaur Taylor, leads to shenanigans. Overall, it seems like a really interesting limited card. In Expedition or Throne, probably not so much. It's mildly inefficient. It's very, very deep in green. You kind of just have to get everything you want out of it very, very quickly. And also, like, I can't see this card playing on like a 2/2 Aegis or something like that, which is very common in like the Rakano style setup. A lot of your early attackers are going to be like 3/2s and other things like that, and then they're going to be trading with other 3/2s, so Minotaur Taylor doesn't actually give you any advantage there due to the fact that the extra health is not going to matter that much. So yeah, it's a little weird. potentially very good under certain metas, but most likely just a limited card. And even then, it's a middling to high pick, but maybe not a like super high pick. It's just kind of in there. All right, after Minotaur Taylor, we have Saheen Stateless. This is another look at Governor Saheen, who apparently no longer a governor. Good to know. That actually makes sense, considering that I think his entire dimension was destroyed, so probably looking for some new work. 4 costs 3/4, lifesteal when you have a relic. When you summon him, the enemy player must either give you one of their relics or Saheen deals 4 damage to them. And it's one of those must-choose effects where basically if they don't have a relic, Saheen just deals 4 damage to them. Both of these effects are really good. Saheen's 4 damage is just a pretty efficient damage option. If you already have a relic, that's going to be 4 damage and 4 life, which is super fun. If your opponent has relics, they're probably going to be more willing to take 4 damage than to give you one of their relics, but there's still some potential for Saheen to steal something that's worth value to you and get a little bit of a benefit. I think in most circumstances, though, what you're seeing here is that if you're playing aggressive relics, where you can basically get a small amount of relics down early on to sort of buff your setup, I think the Shadow 2-cost relic probably does something along these lines, the one that draws you a power, then you can then use Saheen to deal a bunch of damage to your opponent and just keep playing them, mirror image them, dark return them, do anything you want to just keep damaging your opponent until they eventually start giving you their relics, and then when they're out of relics, continue to damage them. So yeah, interesting Saheen beatdown type stuff is very likely. Stealing all of your opponent's relics is probably not as, but there are some potential options there that you can play around with. I think the deck does get into a couple of states where the opponent's choice might be the bad one. Okay, next up we have Skycrag. Oh, no, we have Aerial Deployment. This is a 2-cost Unleash card, which is sweet. It is also an Unleash card that does something very weird. Please do the fit to screen. Thank you. Create and draw a random Valkyrie. So this does not play super well in the way of speed or tempo. Aerial Deployment does not give you anything on the turn that it is played, and frequently it will give you things that you might not even be able to play immediately. If you play this card for 4 for 2 Valkyries and it gives you 2 Icarias and you don't have 7 power, that can be a problem, particularly since you wasted your turn playing aerial deployments. So it's not the most amazing card to be playing in like a limited format. On the other hand, Valkyrie are always flyers, which is very, very good. They often have a lot of beneficial effects. They're often really efficient for their particular stat line. The thing that you could definitely run into is that you just make some loyal Watchwings, and those are not going to be cards that you're feeling really happy about playing after you spent an entire turn generating them. On the other hand, maybe you make Icarias or Razans, and in that case, well, things are a lot happier, and this can really get you to some places. I think this card is more of a fun card than it is a good card, but boy is it fun, so certainly worth at least a shot. And in addition, if you have anything that benefits you for creating cards, this is a really great way to create a lot of cards all at once, and created cards having sort of extra benefits really makes this deck work if you're looking for something to play around with. Skycrag Synthesis, 3-cost, double blue with Inscribe, negate an enemy spell, create and draw a random unit with that spell's cost. This is a really cool version of a counterspell. The main reason that it's kind of interesting is that you can always just play it as a power if you're not thinking that you're going to get a good counter off. It is a consistent way to generate a little bit of power while also giving you card advantage on your counterspell at a mere cost of 3. I would say that like a really good example of a card that can be very, very strong is Subvert, which is you take one of your opponent's cards out of their hands, you add it to your hand, and thus you have gained 2 card advantage in the same way that you would off of a Wisdom of Elders or something along those lines. Skycrag Synthesis does that same thing, where it disrupts your opponent's strategy, it gives you a card, and therefore you get a bunch of card advantage out of it. However, Skycrag Synthesis does this by completely screwing with your opponent's plan, and then giving you something that is completely random and kind of potentially cruddy. I think there are a lot of interesting possibilities for this card. I think it might be just an amazingly fun counterspell. I don't know if this is great as a counterspell, but I think it's so fun that it should be played as your primary counterspell. Like, it's just way too interesting not to play around with, right? The Inscribe really sells it for me. That just gives the card the little bit of flexibility that you really need out of a power card like this. And if your opponent just ends up playing like an all units deck, then it does something. It does something kind of helpful. And I think that's got some potential. Even in like a throne format, I can kind of see this card being played. It might just be an interesting option for those weird throne-based counterspell decks. I don't know. There's some potential there. Grumbo, Total Legend. This is a 1/1 with at 2 cost. And when you play another unit, you gain health, and Grumbo gets +1/+1. All good things, really. If you get this card in a draft, you're just really, really happy that you did. Because a 2-cost 1/1 that consistently grows up every turn is just great, and all you have to do is play more units, which is sweet. In addition, that little extra bit of health that Grumbo is giving you triggers a lot of life force type effects, allows you to do some really interesting weird shenanigans, and stabilizes you in limited formats, which is very, very important, because if you're playing up against flyers or unblockable units or any other amount of like just random bits of damage, Grumbo is like the card that is valuing out while also giving you extra stabilization and time to value out. Overall, seems like a really cool design. Should be very fun in Expedition and in Limited. In Throne, 1/1s for 2 don't get very far, but Throne Life Force probably plays this because it gives you so many Life Force triggers, and all you gotta do is just play your normal Life Force units, which then immediately get their Life Force benefits. And yeah, that's a whole type of deck that's just gonna be really, really fun to play around with. Grumbo's also adorable, so can expect to see him more just on account of the fact that he's really, really cute. Toxicology. Deal 2 damage. You can discard a card to give Toxicology deadly first, which then makes it a removal card. It's kind of equivalent to Collapse in Argenport, where you can discard a card to just kill like anything, except that it's slow speed, it only targets units, and it also deals damage, so it's prevented by damage preventing effects. Which is a lot of caveats. Overall, I don't think this card is amazing. I do think deal 2 damage for 2 is decent, and that is something that Shadow doesn't usually have a lot of access to, so as a minor removal card, it's fine. But Shadow normally in this spot has something like Victimless Crime or Annihilate, where it's just killing the unit dead. In this case, you have an option against Sights. You have a couple of interesting tools against relic weapons. These are not traditionally things that Shadow can attack quite as effectively, so using Toxicology as your removal spell does make sense in those circumstances. And if you can figure out ways to leverage the discard in particular to, say, force the discard and trigger something as a result of the discard, then Toxicology becomes a lot more interesting. Think of this card as an opportunity to discard a card, rather than discarding a card as a cost. In the meantime, the card does deal with Sights, and it does deal with relic weapons. Shadow probably needs both of those things in Expedition, so that, I think, might be a bit of a reason to run the card in the first place. Next up, we have Display of Passion, which means there are monocolored displays in this format. 3 cost, deal 4 damage to the enemy player, or play an Ornate Katana on one of your units, or deal 5 damage to an enemy unit with Endurance and Lifesteal. So likely we'll see a full set of these. That's going to be really, really exciting. The 3 things that it does are okay. The Display of Passion's primary benefit, I think, is the 5 damage to a unit with Endurance or Lifesteal. Units with Endurance and Lifesteal generally have 5 health, I would say. There's not that many that have 6, with the possible exception of Sandstorm Titan. But a lot of like 3/5s, Magnaventris in particular is just really easy to kill with this. And then you also have the option of breaking your opponent's relic weapons, or if you just don't really need this card, you can just play a katana on one of your units and draw a new card, which is okay. A 2/0 weapon with an extra card draw is fine if you're just cycling the card at fast speed. In addition, it makes a pretty neat combat trick if you're playing with quick draw, if you're playing with taunt, or if you're playing with anything along those lines where you just really need to trade with your unit. This is a decent display. I think it's not the most powerful one, but I do think it kind of gives Fire a number of different things at once, even if it is not reliable removal, which is the one thing that you probably most want out of good displays. Still, seems pretty reasonable. There's definitely a lot of interesting options there, and yeah, definitely some potential. Shrivel. Give a unit -4/-4 this turn. It's a 2 cost, and it's double shadow, but it's fast. Easy peasy, simple removal, very good in limited, probably pretty strong in expedition. Certainly nothing wrong with it. The thing I think I love the most out of it is that that's just Zito. Zito is causing the shrivel? Why is Zito causing the shrivel? The cat is magic? Oh no. We always knew that Scruffles McFluffington was a killer, but we never seen it up close. There we go. Yeah, this card is really reasonable in Expedition and in Draft. It's probably not amazing in other formats, but I think this can like break some revenge cards in some interesting ways and prevent certain things from just popping up and consistently recurring just due to the fact that, well, it doesn't work on things that are like permanently recurring because it is only this turn, but it will turn off revenge, which is reasonable if you want that in your removal. Life-changing meal. This is a fun one. This is a 6 cost. Transform each of your units with 3 health or less into a random unit that costs 1 more. Each of your units with 4 health or more gets transformed into a random unit that costs 2 more. This is a good version of like mass unstable form where you get like even more benefit if your units are big and tanky and weird. I wouldn't say that mass unstable form was ever extremely strong, so this is just like fine, but it's so much fun. The main reason that you are going to play this card is you're in a draft format and you just want a card that's going to make all of your other units that suck into units that don't suck, because random units are sometimes just better than the units that you have in draft, and Life-Changing Meal really makes those units quite a bit more efficient and expensive. In addition, if you're playing around with any sort of transform mechanics, it's reasonable. I don't think it ever plays in Throne because 6 is a lot to pay if you're just doing a bunch of transform effects, but yeah, you can get some benefits out of it. Rivets Wrench. Once per turn, you can pay 2 to discard a card, and discard a card to create and draw a random attachment. There's so much fun to be had with this card. I think the main thing that you need to do with this is like figure out some way to create small, easy, cheap options to discard. The most common options are power bursts and snowballs. Those are often frequently generated in your hand. They count as like half a card, and if you're discarding them to create just random weapons, relics, the fact that it's such a wide pool of different options does mean that it's fairly unlikely to ever be super worth it, but turning a snowball into like a Sword of the Ruined King or Sword of the Sky King is just a once in a lifetime experience that everyone should have. So yeah, I think this one's definitely more fun than anything, but it is a really fun option for sealed and limited decks that are playing around with like just minor half cards. I think you can kind of do it in Expedition, but paying 2 for a random card is a lot, especially when you have to discard a card to get the random card. There's some potential there, but I think it's unlikely to be a particularly powerful choice for those types of decks. Beaker Blast. Deal the damage to an enemy. If it dies this turn, it gets voidbound, and if you have 2 red invulns, it's double damage, so it's 2 for 1. Pretty likely to get that double damage, obviously, and if you can increase the spell damage on this card, that's when it gets a bit more interesting, because 2 damage turns to 4, 3 damage turns to 6, and the card is just cheap and efficient. So if you're playing in like Skycrag, this is a pretty interesting removal option that also shuts down voids. That being said, it's not amazing. It's pretty inefficient. The Voidbound thing is the only thing about it that makes it unique from other removal spells, and there's a lot of decent, efficient damage in the format already. Most notably, there's an Unleash card that's 3 for 3, and that's a little bit more interesting to play around with when you're playing around with spell damage. Still, Beaker Blast, kind of neat, and definitely has some potential to be a little broken if you actually are playing early spell damage with some unusual shenanigans. In a limited format, removal is always good, and this is something where the removal can get really good as long as you're playing around in Skycrag in particular. So definitely some cool stuff there. Resonance Wave. Inscribe, silence an enemy relic, or give one of your units +6/+6 this turn. Cards with Inscribe are always worth a second look, just due to the fact that they fix your power. Silence an enemy relic is reasonable, because that just removes the relic from the game for the most part. There are a couple of cards that still care about whether or not you have a relic, but that is still like a pretty decent benefit. And the other option, give your units +6/+6 this turns, that is a removal card effectively. It's a decent option if you can use it at fast speed. It's not very good at slow. And unfortunately, because this card is slow, I think the +6/+6 is not usually worth it unless you're playing around with taunt or killer or something along those lines. This card's reasonably mediocre. I think expedition decks with a lot of taunt are going to feel pretty okay with grabbing it due to the fact that it is both relic removal and a way to make your taunt units bigger. But in general, putting a large buff on a unit is just asking for it to be annihilated or victimless crimed or whatever the de jour removal of the day is. So typically this is just a way for you to get kind of wrecked, and might not be particularly strong in any sort of format where you have a constructed deck. Striding Skyline. 7 cost 7/7, Overwhelm Unleash. Summon, you can sacrifice a relic to get +7 power this turn. This is a cool one. So you gotta sack relics to get multiple copies of it, because otherwise you're just never gonna pay for that Unleash. But for every relic that you have, you get another Striding Skyline. So if you're playing, say, for example, 4 of the card that's just 2 cost to get a Fire Sigil, and you're using that to get up to these Striding Skylines, suddenly you're playing 3 or 4 of these guys on turn 7, which if you're in a limited format, is just death. There is not a lot your opponent can do about that, except outrace you, in the air or something along those lines. The fact that they all have Overwhelm means that these cards will just absolutely tear in limited if you can get enough relics on the board, and you're going to be more than happy to sacrifice those relics just to create a bunch of ridiculous nonsense sentinels. It's a pretty exciting time. The other thing about this is that these cards really respond well to modifications, giving them charge, giving them charge is definitely one of the strongest ones, because if you give the card charge before it is put out, then it becomes a pretty easy way to just destroy your opponent with an accelerate and a couple of cheap relics. Say the idea is just a Praxis aggression deck, where you're something like, oh, Power Stone, 3 Striding Skylines with charge off of an accelerate. Just that kind of thing. It's a lot of potential damage in a very, very short period of time. It overwhelms the board in pretty dramatic fashion. It's not amazing in most formats, but it is something where if you can actually reduce the card down, the card gets just even more disgusting and also generates excess power for you. And yeah, all kinds of interesting battle skill shenanigans are definitely available. I think this is going to be the focus of one of our first brews, and we're going to be doing something pretty fun with it. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a good time. Next up, we have the Blackmaw Carnosaur. This is a 6/6 deadly with taunt while the enemy player has more units than you, and lifesteal while the enemy player has more health than you. For a legendary, it's not one of those usual build-arounds. This is a card that's just kind of strong on its own. It's reasonably efficient for its stats. It's a dinosaur, which means that most of the cards that care about dinosaurs are going to have a pretty good time with it. It is capable of killing multiple units with taunt due to the fact that it is always able to handle double blocks. The thing about taunt units is that typically they eventually become obsolescent because you can just block them with 2 units at a time. With Blackmaw Carnosaur, that's going to wrath your opponent's board. So the more things that you have to array against Blackmaw Carnosaur, the more card advantage you are losing. In addition, the lifesteal when the enemy player has more health than you means this card's pretty likely to stabilize you in some interesting ways, and I think that 5-cost 6/6 just kind of hits a sweet spot for stats, which makes it a reasonable mid-range option. It's not going to blow anyone's hair back, I think. It's just decent overall, and generally pretty good everywhere. I would say probably not an amazing throne card unless you are playing specifically some sort of dinosaurs in shadow. In service, Shadow has this consistent theme of just heroes are better than other people, and it's very weird and pretty interesting in this particular respect. Play a non-hero unit from your void, and yeah, that's the hero unit is now in your service, I guess. In any case, this is something where it's pretty decent, like straightforward. It's a cheaper grasping at shadows, and it hits a wide variety of interesting targets. The fact that it doesn't hit hero units does mean that some of those targets aren't necessarily the ones that you most want to be the focus of your deck, but if you're playing this in a throne deck, you're probably pretty happy to run a grasping at shadows that doesn't cost quite as much, and you're likely to have a larger stable of interesting non-hero units to choose from. So there's some good options here for this in Throne. In Expedition, this card's pretty powerful. Like, Grasping at Shadows is a good card, and this is a card that affects a lot of useful and interesting cards. The main thing about it is that it is not as strong in formats where the heroes are the primary thing that you want to recur. But that's not always the case, and there are a lot of different potential decks that will play around with this particular type of resurrection and get some good benefit out of it. Thunderpop. This is really, really simple. 2-cost, deal 2 damage, and scout. It's fast speed. This is great. This is basically the equivalent of the red one that was 3-cost, Streets of Flame. 3-cost, deal 3 damage, and scout in red, except it's in blue. It does a little less damage, and it costs a little less. I think overall, the fact that this card scouts at 2 means it's a really reasonable removal card. Obviously, it doesn't kill as many targets, but it's still useful against sights. It's still useful against most enemies. It still benefits off of scaling spell damage, which is something you're going to see a lot of in blue in general. I think you do need spell damage to make this card work, but if you have good spell damage options, I think it's potentially even a throne card, just due to the fact of that it is something that will make sure that you consistently hit power while also being a removal spell and also being like an interesting role-playing damage spell. There's a lot of cards that care about spells that do damage in blue, which makes it, I think, even more interesting than Streets of Flame in red. Although I think I might rate Streets of Flame a little higher than it, just for the fact that the card just kills way more things. Eggsnatch. Steal an attachment of your choice from the enemy player's hand. Put it on top of your deck. So, this is a single discard, but you do get the card. On the other hand, the discard focuses on attachments specifically. Now, attachments does include relics and equipment and relic weapons, so that is a wider variety of cards to pick, but I frequently have problems hitting non-power cards, much less just like a non-unit, non-spell card. So yeah, this is something where I'm a little skeptical of the value of this one. Obviously, it is really fun to steal things, and this is a interesting implementation of the like discard a relic type setup. I think Shadow continuing to struggle with like ways to deal with relics is really interesting, and like all of the different designs that are like, haha, we found a way to address it, but really haven't quite are pretty fun. There's a lot of interesting things to play around with. There's a lot of different choices now for dealing with relics. All of them are bad, but you need to use one of them most likely, so might as well be eggsnatch. Okay, next up we have oof. Pick clean. This is a bad card. 1 cost, each card in the enemy void gets void bound. Fast speed. I mean, if you need to market something to shut off a void strategy, this is still not that great. You do get to void bind everything, but like the thing that you do with this in Throne is you just play Steward of the Past and you silence all your opponent's units and then you're fine. With Pick Clean, I guess the thing that is really interesting about it is that you can use it in response to Davia. So, like, if your opponent is like, haha, I discarded a bunch of 8 of the Hurus, and then they play Davia Shieldbreaker and start, like, popping a card out, I think you can pick clean in response and prevent the card from being played. It's possible that the card is still on the stack and therefore doesn't get countered out by that kind of thing, but this is like a really interesting response to that, where it's basically just like, oh, your opponent is trying to do a weird recursion strategy. Let's turn it off at fast speed as a surprise, and then just see if they instantly concede. So, as a market card, I think it's interesting. As a meta card, like to counter the meta, I think it's okay. I'm not in love with a card that is just always dead, except against cards that are like very void strategy heavy. Overall, not a big fan of this one. It's a interesting safety valve, but not like in a really good way, or maybe even in a healthy way. There's a lot of like potential weird options for it. All right. Oxidize. Negate an enemy spell that isn't fast, or deal 6 damage to an enemy wielding a weapon. Simple, cheap, and decently effective. Negation is decent. You're always happy to have it. Having it at this cheap of an option is pretty good. Blue has a lot of good counter spells in this format, so it's gonna be some interesting choices. Deal 6 damage to an enemy wielding a weapon does mean that you're getting 2 cards worth of advantage when you're actually using this as a removal spell, and when you're not using it as a removal spell, you're using it to mess up one of your opponent's like more ridiculous and expensive spells, most likely. I think it's pretty likely that you get to play this card as a counterspell. It's less likely that you get to play it against an enemy wielding a weapon, and if you do either, you're really happy. And the chance of doing it, I don't know. I'd rate it high enough to actually justify running the card in Expedition, maybe even in Throne, and yeah, get some good benefits out of that. Next up, we have the Chemtrail Burst. This is a 2 cost, Unleash. Your units get +1 strength this turn. So it's kind of like a rally, except that it costs 1 less to get the +1 benefit, and 1 more to get the rally benefit. So if you want to do like I think it's 1 more than any type of normal thing that you would hit. So like there is a 1 cost card that gives units +1 strength this turn. There is a 3 cost card that gives units +2 strength this turn. Chemtrail Burst is 2 for the 1 and 4 for the 2. So it's always a little more inefficient, unless you reduce the cost of the card with Trail Storage or something like that, in which case it is as efficient as a card as you can play. The thing is that even at 1, I'm kind of skeptical about this card, because you had to do something to get the card down to 1, and that is not necessarily going to be enough to justify just a rally. Still, it is decently flexible. It works pretty well with flyers and tokens and other things like that. You get a lot of benefit out of the fast spell option because you get to trade with a bunch of stuff. So the card has its places, but I think they belong pretty sorely in Expedition or in Limited. Even in Throne, a big rally effect with like a cheapening could be really interesting, but there's a lot that you have to do to get a board to the state where that becomes viable, and I think that might be a few too many hoops to jump through just to get a single one-time bonus like that. Hot Hand. This is give you one of your units +1/+1 strength. When it hits the enemy player this turn, you draw a card and kill an enemy attachment. So a lot of things going on here. It's a slow speed effect, so you do have to use it on basically an unblockable or flying unit to guarantee the effect, or use it on a unit that just isn't on the board. But if your opponent is playing, say, a 2-cost relic to draw a card, this is something where you can, or to draw a sigil, then this is something where you, playing a 1-cost card to attack them with, can then respond with a hot hand, give that unit a permanent +1/+1 bonus, and then kill their little extra relic benefit and get a card back. So a lot of potential value there. I think overall the fact that the card gives a permanent bonus of +1/+1 is probably what pushes it over the edge in terms of value. You're not always going to get that hit the enemy player effect, but a small bonus to a single unit is usually worth playing for if the unit is something important. Say a Crown Watch Paladin, 2/2 with Warcry and Aegis. That's something that you're pretty happy to buff up like that. And your opponent's not terribly likely to block it as a 3/3, which means you get to eat up their stuff, potentially force a block, or even get a free attachment destruction on top of a card draw, which all of that's lots of value. I think this probably sees some play in Expedition. I think it's a little slow for Throne, but not impossible in that format. Next up, we have, I believe, Eclipse. Yep. Whew. 3 costs, Unleash, gain 3 health, and Scout. If you've gained 9 health or more this turn, you play a Lux Penumbra. And do I know what a Lux Penumbra is? I believe we do. I just gotta go find it real quick. So a Lux Penumbra is a 9-cost 9/9 with pay 5 to give your other Radiants and all units in your hand, deck, and void +1/+1 strength. And not pay 5 power, pay 5 health. Which you can do as many times as you like, which is very exciting for a number of different reasons. This is an interesting card to evaluate, but overall a pretty interesting card for big life decks. I think I really like the concept of a multiple health pay effect that is effectively just buffing your Radiants, because Radiants are not typically known to have charge or any sort of effect where getting that +1/+1 bonus is going to be the immediate end of the game. If you are using health to give all of your Radiants big bonuses, this is still something where you're not necessarily putting yourself into a position to win. So the more you spend on this, the more at risk you are of getting harsh rolled out and then immediately losing to something weird. It's got some odd potential. But the card already gives you a lot of life, and then it gives you a 9/9, and that is probably enough to benefit some Life Force decks, but mostly some decks that just want to play big Xenon with like a decent amount of advantage and stabilize against aggro. I think that's the main thing where it's like, oh yeah, this is pretty okay under those circumstances. You can actually do something halfway decent with that. So yeah, some good potential here. It's definitely an unusual card. 3 cost is a little bit much to pay for something like this, but it is pretty interesting. And of course, you do get to unleash the card multiple times, and you get the Scouts, which I think is pretty cool. So I like playing this almost more in addition to other life gain effects than playing it specifically for its unleash. I think it's just a little more interesting if you're actually gaining life off of other cards, and a little bit more effective if you can play the card early as opposed to unleashing for it late. Paying 9 for a 9/9 that has that ability is not good enough, even if you gain the health. Rewind. 10 cost, unleash, voidbound, take an additional turn after this one. I appreciate that we can. I'm not sure that we should. It's a 4 influence card. It has Voidbound, so it's impossible to like repeatedly attack with it. I think playing this card out of your void for free off of a card and then unleashing even 1 copy of it would be pretty sick. So that's definitely worth noting. On the other hand, like, say you reduce this card down to 1 and you take 10 additional turns. I mean, that's a weird circumstance, especially if your deck is bad and doesn't There are a lot of like eternal. This is a common problem in Magic, is sort of my thought, is where like you spend a lot of effort on an infinite turn combo, and you have to focus the deck so much on the infinite turn combo that there isn't a way to win really, except by just taking your infinite turns and grinding through them until you find a victory condition. Say you rewind 10 times, and that's because you spent a lot of effort reducing the cost of rewind down to 1 while increasing your power to 10. Do you still have units that can attack after that point, or is your opponent stuck in hell while you play all of these different turns at a time? I think the answer is usually no, but in the circumstances where it's not, I'm a little skeptical of the design of this card. It's okay. 10 for a single turn is very good. Like, if you are just in a position of value and you want to pay 10 for a card that gives you an additional turn, that's not a bad thing to like spend on. If you've got just like even one more 7/7 than your opponent, this is a reasonable effect that gets you a lot of benefit. But yeah, that unleash and the combos that it's looking for, it's probably the most likely to be really unhealthy for the game. I'm not sure. We'll see. Rockfort. We have... Nope. Okay. The start of your turn, play an Etched Totemite. Pay 5 to give a unit +1 strength, charge, and taunt this turn. So Etched Totemites are 0/1s that I believe sacrifice at the start of your turn for a power. It's not bad, and you definitely... Or it might be the end of your turn. we could go looking, but I think overall the idea is card that you sacrifice for power and have to sacrifice for power. In addition, I think the 5 ability where you actually give a unit taunt is very, very good, particularly if you're playing with very, very big and scary cards. Paying 3 is not unreasonable for something that gives you consistent unit-based value over time, and paying 5 for that extra bonus is just icing on the cake. I think repeated extra totemites to sacrifice to combusts and other things, that red, yellow, purple deck that always wants to just sacrifice lots of units, having an endless supply of them is pretty good for that type of deck. So this sees play in Throne, Expedition, and in Limited. In all 3 situations, pretty reasonable card, not too much to pay for a relic, and enough to actually do some pretty exciting stuff. Friend's Insight, 2 cost, draw a relic or unit from the top 4 cards of your deck and discard the rest. Reasonable, decent, even downright excellent tutoring. Like, this is a little better than that Feln tutor because you just get to pick up any number of interesting options. And more importantly, you get to pitch a bunch of cards that you wouldn't otherwise be able to pitch. Bren's Insight notably just sets up Davia because A, you draw Davia, and B, you discard all the cards that you want to put in Davia. That alone makes this card really strong for Throne, really strong for Expedition, and pretty decent for draft. It's not like you usually use a lot of these cards in draft because like tutoring in draft is just not as effective as playing efficiently, but you do get some pretty decent benefits from this, and if you're playing void-based strategies, you're going to feel pretty happy about that discard. I think this card is potentially even broken. It's quite wild and does a lot of good things with voids, so having all of that void hate really makes a lot more sense when you see cards like Brent's Insight. Last one. Oh, better than ever. Each unit you played this turn gets a random battle skill. I love this one. I don't think there was ever any like case that I wasn't gonna love this one, but it's a little 0 cost card that you just use to make all of your units weird. And making all your units weird and better than ever is great. If you're playing in a lot of like weird void-based synergies, if you're playing like a fairly efficient deck that just wants to bring units back from the void constantly, giving those units extra battle skills is quite interesting, and you can do a lot of interesting shenanigans with it. The restriction is that you have to play the unit that turn, so it's just like, sometimes it's just going to give you 1 extra battle skill on a card that maybe didn't even really need it. But if you're playing a bunch of tokens or a bunch of weird nonsense and you just want to give a bunch of strange battle skills to a thing, this is a really cool design. I think it's not terribly efficient, but battle skills become very interesting when you are playing around with battle skill matters types decks, which Throne in particular has a bit of a monopoly on. In all circumstances, this is a card that's very niche, very specific, maybe not that powerful, but it's very fun, and there's really nothing wrong with just saying that you want to play a pretty efficient 4-3 on 3, and then just give it something cool. Maybe it gets Aegis. Maybe it gets unblockable. Maybe it gets reckless and you're sad. In all of those circumstances, like, Better Than Ever is a really interesting card to play, and 0 is a low cost to pay for a spell, so there's some real potential there to trigger something interesting off of it. I think Spellcraft decks, take a look at it. Battle skill decks, take a look at it. Expedition decks where you have just fairly efficient units to drop every turn, take a look at it. In all of those situations, maybe the card is good, probably not, but it's so much fun to play. Why not give it a shot? That is the last spoiler that we are reviewing for now. I'm sure I missed a few, but we will have the opportunity to talk about all of them in the future. Remember that we are streaming on Wednesday, 1:30 PST, and we will be streaming the new set Unleashed, which we are so excited for. This video took a long time to record, and it is probably going to have a pretty long runtime. I hope you enjoyed it, as it is the very last as Loco Pocho. So stay tuned. Be sure to follow and subscribe, because our name is changing, and we'll see you next time with more Eternal spoiler breakdowns and card breakdowns and brews and all sorts of exciting nonsense for the future. Until then, have a good one.